Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, it's almost the end of 2016. It'll be our last programme of the year tomorrow, so we're getting D-Mob happy here. There's always a tendency to think the moment we're living in is unusually tumultuous, but this year has surely been dizzyingly interesting. We'll talk through it shortly. What's the right frame to view it through? But first, how will historians look back on it? We like to be first with the news, so I've been speaking to three of them to get an early draft on the year that was in its own way revolutionary, 2016.
President-elect of the United States of America, Donald Trump.
The year could be remembered for lots of things.
The British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path.
Well, Lenin said there are decades when nothing happens and then weeks when decades happen.
It was the year that globalisation went into reverse. And the nation-state reasserted itself as the governing concept of choice. After decades of walls coming down, it was the year of barriers going up.
We have to build a wall, folks. We have to build a wall.
A year that nationalism and naked tribalism reasserted itself too.
They also want to fight for the preservation of our own identity.
Does hate arise out of fear? And is that what's being expressed?
A year of anger and division.
Shame on you, Boris! You're parasite, Boris Johnson! Parasite!
A year that traditional politics and its parties began to fall apart.
Owen, you know perfectly well what the answer is, that I voted Remain, and I'm very surprised and actually quite disappointed that you should even raise this question.
The year that truth became stretched and political communication changed.
You bragged that you have sexually assaulted women. Do you understand that?
No, I didn't say that at all. I don't think you understood what was said. This was locker room talk.
Whether you like him or not, and I don't, he is clearly an incredibly talented 21st century communicator. People will expect that from their leaders after 2016.
For me, 2016 has been something of a blur. Not just a sense of events overtaking us. There haven't been that many events, they've just been rather important ones. More a sense of assumptions changing. For many, it's disorienting, and they reach out for historical parallels. Some reassuring ones, or some obvious and rather dark ones. The most commonly cited comparator is the 1930s, and it's easy to see why.
You have outsider parties or outsider movements that arrive on the political scene saying we're not the same as the other people, we're different. We're going to sweep away systems which are not working for ordinary people. And that becomes enormously seductive to people who do feel either that they've been left behind or that their voices are disregarded.
It wasn't just the Nazis. Italy, Spain and Portugal all had their fascists too. There was Oswald Mosley in the UK and the left-wing populist Huey Long over in the US.
Those outsider parties have been relatively contained in Western democracies since the end of the Second World War. But now they're here, and we're very worried about them.
The 30s can also be remembered for a US-led tariff war disrupting trade, adding to the disintegration of international cooperation.
But I also think issues are very tricky at the moment in terms of the breakdown of what have been very, very secure international organisations, especially the EU, NATO, for all its faults. And these seem to be under great pressure. And if you lose the structures of international collaboration, such as they are, which allow people to think collectively or allow them to think internationally, then it is lost. And I think, in the 1930s, internationalists were very, very difficult to find.
A vast pro-Nazi gathering carrying on the pro-Nazi campaign of Back to Germany.
But historians are never keen on glib comparisons, particularly to the 30s. By reaching for the most familiar piece of history, we can miss other parallels.
Well, we've got to be very careful of this 1930s comparison. I mean, the fact is, it's the only history that's taught in our schools. So one of the reasons everyone's mentioning it's the only history anyone knows anymore. This isn't fascism. There are no militarized paramilitary organizations, as there were in the 30s, that really characterize the 30s. You know, there aren't stormtroopers. There aren't black shirts. Things are very different today. This is actually, in many ways, the working of democracy.
The working of democracy in the sense that...
Well, one of the great things about democracy is that it reflects the differing views of the voters. And they can make changes, radical changes, without having to turn to revolutionary violence. And one of the roles of the media has got to be not to indulge in hyperbolic Hitler spotting.
Perhaps then the year should be seen as one in which the elite were overthrown.
I don't think it's so much the 1930s. I mean, perhaps the 1830s is a better one. Then you had Prince Metternich, the Chancellor of Austria, and a group of like-minded monarchs and statesmen actually deciding what was good for Europe for 30 or 40 or 50 years. And they believed, a bit like the EU elite today, that they were absolutely right. There was no other way but their way. And of course, gradually bubbling under was a resistance to this. So maybe the 1830s instead of the 1930s.
It's hard to make sense of 2016, the end of one kind of order, but we haven't yet seen the construction of a new one. 2 or 3 times in a life, you get a year that is a junction in the course of history. And I think we've just had one. We're at a kind of confusion of different directions. And that explains many of the contradictions we're seeing. Donald Trump getting the support of American conservatives, even though he isn't a conservative, he's an economic interventionist. Brexit, apparently a protest vote against globalization, and yet the Brexiteers say, we're going to now become a beacon of global free trade. We're all over the place at the moment. It's a complete mess. And that perhaps suggests there are useful parallels to be drawn to those messy historical upsets that come along every now and then, in the form of revolutions.
Lenin would definitely have recognized this as a revolutionary moment, and he would have found a way of seizing upon it. Revolutions happen when assumptions that generations have had for a very long period have broken down and people no longer believe in them. And we're seeing that very much in 2016.
Russia, of course, had 2 revolutions in 1917. One overthrew the Tsar and all the old assumptions. It was the second, months later, that saw an opportunistic Lenin grab power.
He promised people everything and anything. He lied unashamedly. He identified a scapegoat that he could then blame for everything. He used the word elite a lot. He said people had not really had heard too much from experts.
One feature of the current situation is not just that events are unpredictable, but that you can get perverse outcomes. Democracy has its foibles, and the public can get things that perhaps they never really intended. You can have a binary vote, very evenly matched, that then leads to quite an extreme outcome. Now, public preferences are quite complicated things. We all want the public to have their say, but the challenge is to reduce that down to something simple while capturing some of the nuance, and to make sure that in the process, the public do get what they really want. Can the outcome sometimes be very perverse? That there's a sort of, the intended outcome of the revolution is not where the revolution ends up?
Yes, I mean, one very obvious one is the French Revolution, or one of the most famous of them all, when they wanted to get rid of a king and they ended up 10 years later with an emperor.
When Hitler was called to become Chancellor in January 1933, he was intended to be the puppet of right-wing conservatives. And of course, within weeks, he was out of control. So there's an unintended consequence of a major, major sort.
1830s, 1917, 1930s, each history has something useful to say. But none can really tell us where 2016 will lead.
I don't think you've had the revolution yet, Evan. I mean, I think if the revolution is coming, we'll know about it. It won't just be two unexpected elections. This is not 1917, ladies and gentlemen. This is the year that democracy actually spoke.
Come back in 100 years and I'll tell you about 2016.
Three historians in their views there. Well, Mary Calder's from the London School of Economics, and John Fredericks is a talk radio host. He joins us from Virginia. Great to have you, John. Welcome, Mary, too. Mary, do you find yourself at all attracted to any comparisons to the 1930s, or are you just Hitler-spotting if you look for them?
I think there are two comparisons. I mean, one is this sense of foreboding, this sense that we're in a phony war and that we haven't yet really felt the effects of Brexit and Trump, and that something bad is going to happen. The other is that this is all about the crisis of political representation. And I think what is really disturbing, which is what happened in the 30s, is the way the opposition is caving in. What you see is the opposition is totally on Brexit in this country, is totally accepting Brexit. Nobody is saying, look, we may have voted for Brexit, but it's really bad for us. Everyone is caving in on immigration. We can't actually control immigration. So if the opposition goes on and on, agrees to talk about control of immigration, it just feeds the right-wing discourse. And more alarmingly, I think it legitimizes the growth of hate crime. So I'm really nervous about where it will lead. We won't be able to control immigration, and I think it could lead to really dangerous racism and violence in the future.
OK, well, that's a pessimistic view. John Fredericks, I know you're not in that camp. What do you think when you hear people evoke the 1930s at this point?
Well, look, Kevin, first of all, thanks for having me. And Mary just gave you the view of the globalist elitists that really don't understand exactly what is going on across the world. This is, first of all, this has nothing to do with the 1930s movement towards fascism. That was about nationalism. This has nothing to do with that. This is about sovereignty and jobs. This is a workers' revolution. Has nothing to do with ethnicity or race. It is not a revolution of nationalism. It's a worklash. This is about jobs. People in various countries, they want their countries back. They have seen their jobs shipped all over the globe because the elite globalist international gangster-bankster network has scoured the earth for cheap labor and shipped their jobs everywhere. Or they've let illegals come in to take their jobs. This has nothing to do with anything except people wanting jobs. Let me tell you something. With all the talk about whatever Mary was saying, right, all the elitist gobbledygook that you just heard, let me tell you something. Economic prosperity and jobs is the great equalizer. It is the great unifier. A paycheck has no ideology.
John?
Putting feet on
John, can I come in? John,
no political philosophy.
John, very, very briefly, in a line, you're saying it is an anti-globalization thing, but it's not a nationalism thing. And that's quite a subtle distinction. Just in a sentence, what's the difference between wanting your country back and wanting to make America great again, and being a nationalist?
Because it's not about America, it's about American jobs.
Okay.
That's what this whole thing is about. Right. This is a jobs revolution.
Okay,
this would not have happened if we didn't have...
I completely agree that this was an anguished vote of those left behind by globalization. But the answer to that cannot be nationalism. The answer has to be internationalism. It has to be dealing with those multinational corporations and taxing their safe havens, which is what the European Union does. It has to be regulating financial speculation. If we really want big programs of public spending in a globalized world, we can only do it through institutions like the European Union. And so to argue that this is an answer to the problem is crazy.
Right. Now, look, can I suggest that actually what this year has been is the collapse of a kind of left-right dichotomy. And what we have now, represented here in this discussion, is the new dichotomy, which is essentially a kind of open to the world, international collaboration as the solution, to the nation-state being the answer to the world's problems. And, John, you're basically it's not really a right-wing or left-wing thing anymore, is it? I can't place Donald Trump. He's a big interventionist, he's a protectionist, he's not... He's difficult to place on the left-right spectrum, but boy, we know where he stands on the kind of national versus globalism spectrum. Is that fair as a kind of where politics has moved?
Well, he says he's
John.
Okay.
Evan, you're right. This is a transformational president, and President-elect Trump is transforming the Republican Party in America. But the real bottom line to this is, and I disagree with Mary on this, Mary, what this whole movement is about across the globe, both in the United Kingdom, now it's happening in France, it just happened in the United States, is people want their countries back, but it's not a movement of nationalism. It's a movement of protecting jobs. The international bankster globalist network scours the earth for cheap slave labor in order to cut out workers that make a decent wage. When you get down to it, this whole argument, everything that is happening, the reaction is to the globalist search for cheap slave labor, and they cut out the jobs of people in those sovereign nations.
Let me put that to Mary, John.
Is, hey, I want to stop this. I want to get my jobs back. That's what this whole thing's
Mary,
about.
it is so striking, because I think of you as quite a sort of liberal, left-leaning person. He is John is sounding so much more left-wing than you do. He's sounding like almost a Marxist. This is the capitalist plot, effectively, to drive wages down. But
I don't disagree with him about the movement, about globalization, but I think globalization has also brought huge benefits. The problem is we've had dramatic economic growth, but it's only benefited the rich. And if we want, we can't go backwards on globalization. Globalization is not just about multinational corporations and free trade. It's about international communication. It's about interdependence. So if we want to do anything about it, the only way we can do something about it is having a say.
Taming it by international cooperation.
Taming it by international cooperation. And by the way, I want to add, it's rubbish to say it's not nationalism. That stuff about making America great again, that stuff about not allowing Muslims into the United States, that is not just about jobs, that's pure racism.
OK, and I think we've lost John, but at this point we need to stop anyway. Mary, thank you. And John, I think we might have lost the sound feed to you, annoyingly. Thank you very much indeed. Your point was well made.
I've been getting